when I went east to Carlisle School. I thought I was going there to die. I could think of white people wanting little colored children for no other reason than to kill them. But I thought, here's my chance to prove that I can die bravely. So I went east to show my father and my people that I was brave and willing to die for them.
Most of us would never think that going off to school would be an act of heroism. But consider how the Lakota educated their children. Living in the natural world was classroom and lessons. Family elders taught children and young people. Learning occurred within the family circle, not outside of it. Education in schools ripped Indian children away from everything they knew about learning, working, and living together. Luther Standing Bear's journey to boarding school required traveling by steamboat and railroad. Though they had never seen a train, the children climbed aboard anyway. Later, because village elders had said that the world was flat, many of them worried the train was taking them to the place where the sun rises, where they would then be dumped over the edge of the earth. Imagine their fear and uncertainty. In earlier days, Luther Standing Bear would have proven his manhood by capturing horses from the enemy, or by showing his courage in battle. In this new period of crisis and change, he and other Indian youth would show bravery by adapting, by learning new ways, and by using these skills to assert autonomy and to protect their people. Education of the Indian population actually began centuries before Luther Standing Bear's trip to boarding school. From the Franciscan missions of Florida, California, and the Southwest, to the Jesuit schools in Canada and the Northeast, the Catholic presence among the tribes was well established by the early 17th century. Protestant churches also created Indian schools. The earliest was the Reverend John Eliot, who founded 14 praying towns for Indians in Massachusetts from 1651 to 1674. There, Indian residents learned the English language, work habits, and customs. A common theme among all these schools was that the quickest method for civilizing native peoples would come from a program that touched the head, hands, and heart. Indian children would learn basic reading, writing, and arithmetic for the head, manual trades for the hands, and Christianity for the heart. This became the ideology carried by priests and ministers moving west across the continent as the nation grew from 13 colonies to 50 states. In the Dakotas, Jesuit priests had followed the paths of fur traders and begun working among native tribes in the early 1800s. Later in the century, other Catholic orders and Protestant missionaries would join the Jesuits by creating their own schools. These missionaries began by teaching their students in native languages and then adding English instruction. The Dakota and Lakota dictionaries created by these priests and ministers remain important resources for the preservation and study of tribal languages today. By the 1850s, the U.S. government had renewed plans to set aside large tracts of western land where Indians could live while learning agriculture and the customs of the dominant culture. By separating Indians from the settlers pushing west, the government believed they might reduce potential conflicts. In 1858, a treaty established the Yankton Reservation in southeastern Dakota Territory. A decade later, the Treaty of Fort Laramie set aside the western part of the territory for the Great Sioux Reservation. Within 2 years, President Grant instituted a new peace policy to bring Western civilization and eventually citizenship to the tribes. Schools were at the heart of this initiative. Grant's plan divided reservation territory between the different religious denominations and gave them government contracts to engage in missionary work and to create schools. These churches often built boarding schools at the reservation headquarters and day schools at the Indian camps. During these years, tribal leaders were not passive recipients of government support. They asked for schools in treaty negotiations. Many of them recognized that coexistence would require adapting to new customs, and they believed sending children to school would ensure the survival of their people. At the same time, criticism of the Indian education system had been growing throughout the 1870s. Many educators believed that as long as students could return home each night, they would remain under the influence of parents and less likely to adopt new customs. To advance Western civilization among the tribes, in 1880, the Bureau of Indian Affairs required all schools teach in English or risk losing funding. Meanwhile, efforts continued to reform existing schools and to develop a model that would quickly turn Native Americans into farmer citizens loyal to the U.S. government rather than tribal leadership. Lieutenant Richard Henry Pratt, founder of Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania, became a leading advocate for off-reservation boarding schools as the newest improvement in Indian education. Kill the Indian and save the man became the motto for Pratt's method. He developed his plan while supervising Plains Indian prisoners of war in Florida. When Pratt opened Carlisle in 1879, he used military discipline and other coercive tactics to run his school. Indians from South Dakota dominated Carlisle's first class, and Luther Standing Bear claimed that he was the first Lakota to step onto the campus. Believing almost literally that clothes make the man, Pratt had native clothing confiscated, and long hair on boys was cut. Carlisle provided military-style uniforms. Before and after photos of students became Pratt's primary illustration for the success of Carlisle. He had arriving students photographed in the native clothing their mothers had lovingly produced. Then several months later, he had students photographed in their new clothing to show the school's ability to civilize the Indians. Impressed by Pratt's success at Carlisle, the government built 26 off-reservation boarding schools from 1880 to 1908, including the schools in Pierre, Flandreau, Chamberlain, and Rapid City, South Dakota. Catholic boarding schools grew during this period as well. In 1880, all reservations were open to any religious groups interested in running schools. At the same time, Protestant interest in operating Indian schools was waning, and the newly created Bureau of Catholic Indian Missions could lobby for more government contracts. By 1889, 75% of all contract funding for Indian schools went to Catholic institutions. The number of Catholic Indian schools grew for another reason. Mother Catherine Drexel, later St. Catherine, used inherited wealth from her banker father to build schools. Mother Catherine despised the poverty and racism afflicting Indians and African Americans and dedicated her life and fortune to improving their lives. Her wealth supported 145 missions and more than 60 schools, including the construction of new Catholic schools on reservations where they had previously been banned. Her funds built Holy Rosary Mission School, originally known as Drexel Mission on Pine Ridge, St. Francis Mission School on the Rosebud Reservation, and Immaculate Conception Mission School on Crow Creek. All three schools initially operated with a combination of government contract and Catholic funding. By 1891, school attendance for Indian children was mandatory, and Indian agents used various means to ensure compliance. Native police forces rounded up children who were missing. Reservation agents could also withhold rations from Indian families whose children did not attend school. Indian parents found that they had several options for educating their children. Rural day schools existed on the reservations and primarily served students in the early grades. Older students could attend government or religious boarding schools on the reservation. Off-reservation boarding schools offered another option. Most children arrived at boarding school with little knowledge beyond their tribal experiences. They traded a close-knit family life for large institutions led by strangers. Life in a teepee or small cabin became life in huge dormitory rooms with dozens of beds. Accustomed to eating whenever hungry, they now ate according to a clock. Traditional clothing and shoes were replaced by military uniforms, starched garments, and stiff shoes. Long hair was cut short, a symbol of mourning and death in many native cultures. The positive feedback, scolding, and shaming that Indian parents and elders used to guide and teach children were replaced by physical punishments that no Indian parent would have used. Indian students found new forms of discipline, including standing in a corner, kneeling on a beam, eating soap, or being whipped. In all the schools, even the rural day schools, the curriculum divided the day between basic reading, writing, and arithmetic, and a half day of manual training. For boys, this primarily meant agricultural skills, carpentry, shoe repair, and leatherworking. Girls learned housekeeping skills. Learning Euro-American work habits was just as important as learning a skill. Manual training rarely occurred in a classroom setting, but was learned while doing the work necessary to operate the school. Children grew the food and often raised the livestock that supplied their tables. They cooked this food and washed up afterwards. They repaired donated clothing or learned to sew new garments and shoes. They cleaned and maintained the school and often built some of the buildings. In all these schools, Christian principles underlay the program, but character development and religion received a higher level of emphasis in Catholic schools. A Benedictine sister at St. Joseph's Indian School once remarked that education was the goal, education in the 4 R's, with religion being in the first place. And there was time for a 5th R as well, recreation. The response of Indian families to compulsory schooling varied widely. Some parents feared the boarding schools because children living in close quarters were subject to epidemics of measles, mumps, tuberculosis, and other ailments. During one period, 11 of 15 children sent to Carlisle from a Wyoming reservation either died at school or were sent home sick and died shortly thereafter. Families sometimes hid their children when the reservation agent came looking for students. Other parents deliberately chose boarding schools as the best option for their families. While theoretically, the off-reservation boarding schools were intended for older students, parents often lobbied successfully for younger students to be enrolled because they wanted all of their children to be together in one school. Some parents felt that the available day school was of inferior quality or simply too far away for daily attendance, especially in winter, when a distance of several miles through the snow was impossible. In such cases, a boarding school provided the best option for regular attendance. For other families, boarding schools provided a vital service in times of crisis. Too often, a widowed parent simply had no way of caring for children while working to support them. Unemployment left others unable to feed and clothe their children. Poverty and family crises became particularly severe during the years of the Great Depression and kept many schools, including St. Joseph's, filled to overflowing. The boarding school experience for most Indian children remained largely unchanged up through the 1950s. Children were still punished for speaking native languages, and most expressions of native culture were discouraged. Manual training remained a significant portion of the school day, in part because most children left school after 8th grade and they needed job skills. But even as early as 1928, a government report recommended ending manual training because Indian students were not receiving enough academic time. One change that did occur came as off-reservation boarding schools declined in number. In 1908, the Bureau of Indian Affairs concluded that it was less expensive to educate students in day schools. The Chamberlain School, now the site of St. Joseph's, was one of the first off-reservation schools to close. Today, Flandreau Indian School, a high school, and Pierre Indian Learning Center, grades 1st through 8, are the only off-reservation government boarding schools in the state. Contract schools like St. Francis, Holy Rosary, and Immaculate Conception experienced their own funding problems. Concern over their cost, coupled with growing anti-Catholic sentiment, eventually led to the end of government contract funding. Some tribal funding became available, but was short-lived. These schools became dependent on private support. Founded in the 1920s, St. Paul's Indian Mission School at Marty and St. Joseph's Indian School in Chamberlain were in completely different funding situations. Created by the Order of St. Benedict and the Priests of the Sacred Heart respectively, both schools relied on the support of thousands of benefactors from around the nation and overseas, and never received government or tribal funding. Beyond changes in funding, all schools, government or mission, had to adapt to changing times. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed discrimination and led the government to push for higher education standards and new programs for all minorities. By the 1960s and 70s, calls for culturally relevant teaching methods, for programming that explored Native heritage, and for Native teachers and administrators could not be ignored. The Indian men who had fought in World War II, Korea, or Vietnam had come home with different expectations of their place in American society. Native peoples in general sought more influence over tribal affairs, including their schools. All of the schools adapted. In 1969, Holy Rosary changed its name to Red Cloud Indian School. It remains a Jesuit institution, but is now a day school. Immaculate Conception became Crow Creek Tribal School in 1971 and has boarding and day students. St. Francis, once the largest Catholic boarding school in the nation, became a tribal day school in 1974. St. Paul's, now known as Marty Indian School, became a tribal boarding school in 1975. St. Joseph's remains a residential school, but replaced dormitory living with a family homes model in the 1980s. For the past 30 years, these schools have incorporated the Lakota language and Native culture and traditions into their daily curriculums. Native instructors and community elders serve as role models and bring traditional knowledge to classrooms. Visitors walking around any of the schools would see Native imagery and symbolism throughout the campuses. Harsh physical punishments and consequences have ended. Schools that once believed that Indian children could not move forward unless they left their Native culture behind now promote Native pride and culture. These former students defeated the goal of assimilation in Indian schools and led the movement to regain lost languages and cultural traditions. They brought new skills and knowledge back to the reservations and became tribal leaders, business owners, teachers, and lawyers who could protect the needs of their people. They view education as an opportunity to ensure a future for their people. Formal schooling prepares their children to become tomorrow's leaders. Education offers renewed hope for overcoming the poverty that crushes so many on the reservations. Traditional Native stories often include characters that must confront and survive great dangers. Most boarding school students not only survived the experience, but found that it shaped their lives and futures in unexpected ways. And in turn, they grew up and reshaped these schools to better meet the needs of their children and grandchildren. The boarding school story is a complex and nuanced one because it is a story about human beings, generous, loving, dedicated, hardworking, imperfect, misguided, or cruel. There is no one boarding school story. There are as many stories as there are students. It is a story rich in sadness and in hope. It is an American story.